So as Masters of Ceremony, my first task is to introduce the panel moderator. He's from the University of Wisconsin and is vice chair of the CCC, well known to me. CCC is about catalyzing research for the interest of the national priorities, as the title of this conference says. And this panel is getting a perspective from people who either have served in government or are currently serving in government. And I'll introduce the panelists are Will Barkis, Patti Brennan, Jim Carosa, and William Regli. And I'll introduce each of them just prior to their 10 to 15 minute remarks. And then, as with the other panels, we'll have some Q&A, although I don't see any microphones in the crowd. So without further ado, Will Barkis is our first panelist, and part of his job is to give us the Silicon Valley perspective. Silicon Valley is more than just miles away from Washington, D.C., but Will has extensive experience in government. He worked in particular for U.S. Ignite, which was looking at this chicken and egg problem with you want gigabit infrastructure, but you need gigabit apps, and you can't get gigabit apps until you have gigabit infrastructure. So without further ado, Will.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Mark. So first of all, I wanted to thank everyone who came, and in particular the Computing Community Consortium for pulling all this together. In particular, the leadership. So Beth, Minot, and Mark, and Ann Drobness, where she ran off to. So thank you all for bringing all of these great people together to have these very important conversations that we've been having the last couple of days. So I think, and thanks to my very esteemed panelists, I'm very happy to be here sharing my perspective with you all. And so I think the point, I have 3 points I wanted to make. I was going to say them first so that I make sure I say them, and then I'll try and keep coming back to them. But I guess just one note before that. So the reason I think I'm here on this panel is to give a bit of an outsider perspective from someone who was inside but is now outside of both academia, and so I'm a former scientist, but also former public sector public servant a little bit, I guess, at the National Science Foundation. But now I work in Silicon Valley, and I think a lot of this question around broader impact. There's a little bit of an echo chamber effect where everyone here in the room is doing their research and obviously clearly believes in the value of their research, but these events don't tend to pull in people from industry, let's say, as much as they might, and I think I'm trying to give a little bit of that perspective. So the first point I want to make is, and this is maybe for the audience outside the room, but we need more investment in basic research. So, like, soundbite, please give more money, but also more resources more generally. So that'll be point number one, and I'll elaborate on these things, obviously. Point number two, we need more collaboration. So I think the CCC has done a really great job of bringing together very diverse and interdisciplinary perspectives and expertise around some of these very important problems. But we need more of that, and we need more collaboration with industry and government. So I think more collaboration is my second kind of broad point. And then finally, innovation is not easily predictable, is maybe my third point. So which also means that impact is very difficult to predict. And so I think we need to really get our heads around that when we're thinking about policy recommendations and where we spend our money. In terms of whether we do basic research, infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the three broad points. And I think the first one, I think it's clear we need that the value of the investments we made in science and technology in basic research over many decades has paid off. I mean, the top 5 most valuable companies in the world right now are all technology companies: Apple, Alphabet, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook. Someone asked yesterday, I think it was Mark actually, who here doesn't have a cell phone in their pocket? And no one answered that they didn't. And I'd go farther, like, who here doesn't have a smartphone? There are probably a few curmudgeons. So I think people, you don't really have to make the case anymore for the value of computer science and what it's affecting people's lives dramatically. The thing is, we're not anywhere near finished with the sort of the disruptions of where these technologies, where this knowledge is going to take us, right? We are, you know, it feels like a lot has changed in the last few decades, right? I mean, the internet, right? The web, smartphones, it's astounding, the pace, the rate of change. But we're just at the dawn of some of these other, I mean, fundamentally transforming kinds of technologies like artificial intelligence. We've heard a lot about that, right? We're at the dawn of robotics. Some of this stuff, in terms of like, you know, brain-computer interfaces and other things, my PhD is in neurosciences, starts to get into the science fiction realm very quickly. But we need so much more discovery to understand and really make sense and make tools and make, you know, impact people's lives with these technologies. So we need to, you know, continue supporting the actual basic science research. On the issue of collaboration, I think I was talking to some of my colleagues, you know, how often do you use basic research in the stuff that you actually do? You know, many of them were hard pressed to think of the last time they read a paper or, you know, went to a scientific conference or, you know, directly benefited by basic science. But when we kind of talked about it a little bit more and unpacked it, the causal chain is maybe long sometimes, but it's very clear. And so even if the practitioners who are in Silicon Valley kind of heads down doing their thing, trying to often reinvent the wheel better, you know, they may not be directly aware of the results of the research that you all, or the sciences do, but that causal chain is very strong and very intact. So we need to figure out ways, and I think one area from the vantage points I've had that industry doesn't do very well is we don't understand the basic stuff. There's not a lot of time for going, you know, the sort of rigorous analysis of the world. So we trust other people. We trust these other institutions, and it's difficult sometimes for industry to even work together on these things because of either fears of competition or institutional inertia or all these other things. I mean, as an aside, you know, industry definitely can be bureaucratic and slow too. People give government an awful lot of trouble, but my company is 155,000 employees. Imagine, you know, we don't turn on a dime either. So I think we need to find ways in this community, and maybe this is a call to action for this room, is, you know, how do we do things like CCC is doing? How do we continue to do them better? How do we get more industry people in the room here? I think there are only a handful of people kind of from the private sector in this room, and so there's often, you know, the third leg of the stool is kind of a little bit weak in that. So maybe my call to action for the room is to increase the kinds of collaboration with the private sector that we can do. And then maybe finally the broader point around the third point around not being able to predict the outcomes of, or predict where innovation is going to take us. Like we can't just solve the problem, or else we would have solved the problem, right? Like everyone would like to cure cancer, but cancer is actually a lot of different things, and it's very difficult to cure cancer, right? We would like to help the non-sighted be able to get around in the world, but these are difficult challenges. So I think for a certain that sort of core idea has policy implications. We got to fund basic stuff that we just don't have any idea that it's going to actually have a broader impact. I think it's always a good kind of guiding compass to be aiming at impact. But as so many people in this room know, you know, when you're writing the NSF grant or the NIH grant or whatever, sometimes you really struggle to say how the stuff you're actually doing is going to impact someone. It will. It's almost no doubt that knowledge is going to be useful for solving things, but sometimes it's hard to make the case for. So I think we need to not be narrow-sighted in what we fund, in the questions we ask, and the way we talk about them. Sometimes I think science has become a tool in a way that I think we need to make sure we appropriately push back and say that we need to do stuff just for the sake of knowledge. We need to do stuff where we don't know what the outcome is going to be. Of course, problem-directed research is great too, but everyone wants to be in the right quadrant of Pasteur's quadrant. But I think it's important to realize that we need to not be overly prescriptive in terms of trying to find impact. And also along those lines, I think a point I wanted to make. So I work on smart cities stuff. I'm the principal on our smart cities focus out of our office, and I also work with the city of San Francisco as an official volunteer technology advisor to the mayor's office of civic innovation. We're working with the chief innovation officer of San Francisco, Jay Nath, on smart cities, the strategy around smart cities and the Internet of Things, and how cities can put technology to use. I guess I just sort of lost my train of thought. My point was going to be that we don't know what the use cases are that are like the most important ones in smart cities. So, and I think that's true of many technology areas. So we should be investing in the sort of the knowledge bases, the sort of, if you think of knowledge as infrastructure, social infrastructure, other kinds of infrastructure like connectivity. Beth and I were talking about this, but we don't know what people are going to do with it necessarily, but we know they'll do pretty awesome things if we can provide robust connectivity for Internet of Things networks. So there are a lot of new low power, wide area network technologies that are I think are really changing things. So I think we can make safe investments even if we don't know the outcome, because we know that someone will put those things to use. Same with 5G, which is the savior, everyone's sort of savior in wireless, but it probably will take longer to get here than we think, but should be here pretty soon. So things like that, I think, where you don't necessarily know the impact you're going to have, but you know how to build tools that you'll definitely figure out how to use, or how to build knowledge that will definitely eventually be useful. So I guess I just wanted to provide a little bit of an outsider perspective to say, there are many broad impacts. It's essential that we keep investing in basic research, but these are sort of obvious points, but I guess we need to keep making them. So.
All right, thank you very much. Our next panelist is Patti Brennan, and she's the director of the National Library of Medicine. So this library is in some ways like the Library of Alexandria because it's very important. However, it is unlike the Library of Alexandria because it goes way beyond scrolls and has information, all kinds of things. Sometimes that's misunderstood when people see the word library. Before that, I had the privilege of being Patti's colleague at Wisconsin. She's unique by degree. She's the only person I know who's has degrees in nursing and engineering. You probably know others, but you're the only one I know. And so, she doesn't have to go anywhere to be interdisciplinary. She just looks in the mirror. On a personal level, Patti and I also shared a piano teacher who was also iconoclast for many years. So, Patti.
We're not going to play a duet for you, though. Actually, I don't play in public yet. Do you play in public? No, I play for myself. I'm really not very good, actually. I am very delighted to be here. I'm Patti Brennan. I'm a nurse and an industrial engineer, so I'm one of those imaginary engineering folks. My orientation to engineering, though, comes from the decision sciences and analytics. I'm here today to speak to you about healthcare as a growth industry and to invite you to join us to solve important problems for healthcare. I'm also here to talk to you a little bit about the National Institutes of Health and what NIH is doing in terms of its challenges for largely managing the massive amounts of data. 15 years ago, you could finish an experiment, resolve a hypothesis, write a paper, and you were done. And now there's a data set legacy that just hangs around and just cries out for additional federal support. We're going out of money. So I need to talk about that. And then I'm going to leave you with my three wish lists that I hope the computer science community will solve. Healthcare is a huge industry. Almost 20% of the United States gross domestic product is involved in some way with healthcare. I suspect many of you have been involved with different aspects, whether it's care delivery or machine learning or the analytics required to forecast the demand for services over time. The healthcare concerns of this country continue to grow and are incredibly complicated. Every single day, 96 people die of opioid abuse of some type. 96 people. This is a huge problem. This is bigger than AIDS. We are hopeful that the designation of opioid crisis as a United States crisis will accelerate investment in it. But I want you to think a little bit about, what does computation have to do with this? Is it the prediction of a person at risk for an opioid dependency? Is it the massive distribution of Narcan and the chemicals to actually help someone who has overdosed? Is there some kind of protective physical blood-brain barrier that can prevent overdose and its consequences in an individual? We need computational solutions for this, some of them coming out of the physical sciences, some of them better understand the human body and how it responds. Another healthcare priority right now that is equally difficult to address is the mental health crisis in this country. The mental health crisis in this country is old, it's not new, and unfortunately it's accelerated by every single armed conflict we have overseas. There's a massive rise in the demand for mental health services. So right now, since the 1970s, we've had a deinstitutionalization, a removal of patients from hospitals where they were cared for with mental illness. So we have a massive spread across every one of the areas that I heard touched in this meeting in the last 2 days about individuals in cities who don't have the mental resources to cope with the complexity of the cities, individuals who need assistance in the middle of the night when clinical care isn't open. Mental health crisis is important because we believe that by proper prediction and proper medication, many of the mental health problems, but not all of them, can be solved. So we need other kinds of services and support in place. Some of those solutions will be computational, some of those solutions will be policy-based. The third crisis I want to talk to you about is the crisis of well children and the need for us to develop well children. As we have modified our childhood raising practices in the United States to become more dependent on processed foods and education without research, we're raising a generation of individuals who don't understand their bodies in the same way, who have a different kind of complexity as they grow into their later years. Now, this has some really unusual problems, and one of them is there's a diminution of creativity and problem solving across the communities because children have lacked the opportunity for unstructured play as young people. So now the computational challenges is how do we put that back in as an adult to help enhance creativity, to help do what would have been developed naturally on the school playground. Now we have to add in as kids are in high school, college, and on to their later years. So these are the three healthcare crises that I'm concerned about. The healthcare delivery system in this country is expensive. It's reasonably effective for some acute care problems. It's dreadful for chronic care problems right now. We have incredible challenges in finding the proper cost models. We have difficulty in predicting. We have as many indicators for medications as we have indicators against those medications. What's happened in the last 30 years, though, has been several things. First, the acceptance, finally, that there's an evidence base to healthcare. So accelerating the use of evidence in healthcare is actually a reasonable computational challenge. Bringing evidence into the point of care without requiring to go through the eyeballs of the caregiver is an interesting computational challenge that we need assistance with. Secondly, we need cost models based on transactions to move to cost models based on value. So our cost models in healthcare have been driven by what one does as opposed to what one accomplishes. And that shift requires a whole different set of indicators and values. It requires a time shift in monitoring where healthcare changes are detectable. Let's go back to thinking about healthcare changes and their detectability. We need to think about in the moment data capture, access, and recall. So we need power-preserving strategies, power-preserving devices that can sense an individual who's walked into an area where the pollen count suddenly rises, or there's a toxic chemical that they're allergic to, and senses and alerts them to take a specific action. All of that activity cannot happen simply on a main server. It must happen in a local sensing device. We need the resources that can bring us computation, not only at scale and in the moment, but with very little power demand. Now, in the management of data generated in the course of healthcare, we have four critical issues that challenge computation. First of all, healthcare data is highly regulated. In the state of Wisconsin, there was 22 different laws that described what one could do with healthcare data. So the idea that we might integrate all of this wise knowledge from the electronic health record into the individual's care system is actually interfered with by laws that may obstruct that. Secondly, we need computational solutions to our challenges of privacy and fine-grained access control. Right now, we have laws that regulate who can and can't see a clinical record system, and frankly, most patients would prefer to have their data shared if they think it would provide better care for them. And most patients assume it is shared and that we will use it for better care, both of which are a little bit false sometimes. So we need to look at the computational solutions that can address 27 different laws in a single state, plus the federal laws and regulation, and still assure data sharing while protection of management, maximum privacy, and do all of this for unstructured data, because most of the data in healthcare is not structured. And we have had even though we have had 30 years of standard terminologies, we have an incredible reluctance to structure our data. And finally, these data are being stored everywhere and nowhere. They're largely inaccessible, and the fears and the regulatory pressures that keep us from sharing data are actually causing the cost of data storage to increase. So now, let's switch to the National Institutes of Health and what we're going to do about this. The National Institutes of Health is a $35 billion a year operation designed to accelerate discoveries into health. And we have 27 different institutes, one of which is the National Library of Medicine. We're a tiny institute. We're a $400 million a year institute, not the 10 or 12 billion the cancer is. But we're responsible for integrating all of the information in the world. We have 26 million citations in our literature database called PubMed. We have almost 5 million citations, almost 5 million articles in our full text database. Our dbGaP, ClinVar, and our entire genomic database systems are used thousands of times a day. We move a petabyte an hour in and out of our system of information. So the National Library of Medicine is by and large an information push and pull operation. And our responsibilities are to preserve and protect the health knowledge of a discipline, of an era. And so we do have some scrolls in the National Library of Medicine. We do have some 10th century and 11th century very respected medical texts. We have some Chinese texts. We have Dr. Nuremberg's Nobel Prize. We have a range of, and now we're preserving websites. So we preserve, protect, and share. What we're trying to do right now, though, is address the problem that the NIH spends $1 billion a year on data management, largely for data sets that are not easy to share or easy to access, that have curation strategies that might tax even the best of librarians, and are largely driven by human interaction. We believe we have adopted the perspective that data-driven discovery is the future of the NIH, and we need to find ways to ensure access to information while preserving the appropriate levels of privacy for clinical trials. We are experimenting with data commons. We're experimenting with a wide range of curation and management tools. We're in the process of standing up a new identity and authorization management scheme that will allow controlled access to the proper sets of data, role-based access, and in-the-moment engagement. All of these technical solutions really have very little to do with the health operation of our system, but actually are enablers of that health operations. I'm extremely proud to say there's not a discovery that has happened in the last 40 years that hasn't been supported by the National Library of Medicine. This is great, but we don't know how many more discoveries could be enabled if we were a better library. So we're working to improve access to data, to think of data as a new substrate for discovery the way we've done with the literature, to provide better indexing, curation, and sharing tools, to identify metrics that identify the value of a repository. And please don't say use, because use is not enough to show the value of a data set to society. We need to find ways to both accelerate the ingest as well as the sharing of data. We need to determine really if these cloud solutions are actually truly interoperable. I haven't seen it yet, but you guys tell me it's out there. And I also need to be sure that in my responsibilities in directing the National Library of Medicine, that I guide the NIH wisely in the dollar investments for data. And let me tell you, there is nothing more political in Washington than data right now. So I'm going to close with my 3 wishes. I want you to please accelerate augmented reality so that I do not have to read to know. We have learned that giving people a pamphlet at the end of a healthcare encounter does not help them better take care of themselves. But maybe if there was a visualization of an exercise on the wall, or if in fact the refrigerator and the eggs and the ice cream talk to each other, we would get better choices at that level. Can you help us with that, please? Point number 2, we need to find ways to engage people in the scientific process. And while I'm very excited about citizen science and the individual's contribution to data, we cannot use lay people as unpaid data collection staff. We have to find ways to engage their questions and their solutions. And so as you think forward to computational solutions, think of a broad set of users, some of whom are talented and skilled by education, some of whom are naive but still valid participants. And the third computational problem I want you to solve is please get rid of the wires. whatever you can do. Get rid of the power cord, get rid of the cord that connects to the net, get rid of all the wires for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patti. Our next symposium is in 2 years. We'll get back to you on those.
Okay.
So Jim Carosa is the director of the Computer and Information Science and Engineering SCIES at the National Science Foundation. I guess I should issue a disclaimer and a compliment. SCIES is the funder of the CCC, so they're the reason we're at this particular meeting. So Jim has a distinguished history, mostly at UMass Amherst as a professor and a dean, right? You didn't put that in your resume. Chair. And he's a first-rate researcher and educator. I happen to remember as a young professor reading his book and actually understanding layered network protocols better by doing an exercise where I communicated to a mail server with just raw TCP. It's just kind of amazing how a little thing where you actually do it lodges in your memory. So that's an example of him as an excellent educator. Jim.
Great. Is this one? Hello?
Yeah, I think it's live if you start talking.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Speaking of wires. Okay, so my name's Jim Kurose, and I'm really very happy to be here. And like others, I really want to thank the CCC. I want to thank the CCC for this invitation and for really being an effective catalyst for computing research. I had been on the CRA board and knew about the CCC before I came here to DC, but I just cannot tell you how important the CCC and the CRA and the activities that they undertake are for the computing research community. So a shout out to Beth and to Mark and to Anne and Andy and others who all make this happen. It's really important work. So I've been at the University of Massachusetts for 30 years. I've been here for not quite 3, so I'm way more a faculty member than I am an assistant director. And so when I teach, which Mark mentioned, I always hope that people will walk away from or students will walk away from a course and remember 3, best case, 3 things, right? A month or 2 later. And so here, there are 3 things, there are only 3 things I want to talk about here. I want to talk about, you could call them socio-technical or computer-human systems. I want to talk about that. I want to talk about convergence, and I want to talk about partnerships, which actually the previous speakers have already touched upon. So when I came to NSF, Keith Marzullo was division director of CNS. He's right there, and soon afterward, Howard Wackler came, and both of them are really passionate about this notion, and I have caught the bug, and I sort of get it. I mean, I was arguing this at our retreats at the University of Massachusetts 5 years ago. These are areas we need to begin investing in on socio-technical systems, on computer-human systems, because in the end, actually, everything Patti said was all about people, right? If you took, she had 3 points at the end and 3 points in the middle. They were all about people. So in the end, so much of the computing and the computing research that we're involved with are how people, how society, how organizations are going to use computing. And if you look at some of the programmatics that we have within SCIES at NSF, think of NRI, both NRI 1.0 and 2.0 that we launched last November. Co-robotics, the notion of humans and robots working together is really sort of the central theme there. When you think about smart and connected health, for instance, something that we actually do jointly with NIH, it's about big data. I mean, it's a lot about big data. It's about machine learning. It's about sensors. It's about AI, but it's about using it for people. And this notion that we would ever build technology and throw it over the wall, and then all of a sudden, oh, it's so great that everybody's just going to use it. That's not the way the world works, right? So we've got to be involved in this spiral design where people are involved very intimately in the development, in the research that we do, and then the development of new technologies. If you look at cyber learning for work at the human technology frontier, Patti mentioned AR and VR, so that's actually that's sort of a major thrust that folks are looking at there. Smart and connected communities will mention that. That's really, it's all about smart and connected communities with the emphasis on communities. Well, maybe smart and connected too, that's what the technology does, but it serves people, right, in their communities. If you think about secure and trustworthy cyberspace, I see some of our SATC PIs, how security technology is used. You can have the most secure quantum channel you could ever imagine, but if it's not used the right way by people, by individuals and organizations, it's just not worth anything. So I think an emphasis, if I look at sort of the big macro picture within SCIES and within the National Science Foundation, this notion of socio-technical systems, computer-human systems, is something really, really central. You know, one of the things I still haven't quite learned is what to say in public and what not to say in public. So I'll say something that I'm not sure I should say in public, but I'm going to say it anyway. You know, at SCIES, we go on an annual retreat and we talk about, okay, well, what are going to be the future things that are going to be really important? And so we went away this past February and we did that and we had long discussions and we decided to sort of synthesize things. We'd all get 2 tokens so that we could vote about all the things we talked about. What were the 2 most important things? And I will just tell you that socio-technical and computer-human systems was number 1, and number 2 was also really important, but wasn't even a close number 2. So I think there's general consensus, and you can see that reflected in our programmatics. Okay, so that's point 1, socio-technical systems. Sorry, you can just hit me over the head if you want me to stop, Mark. I'll be quicker with the next 2. The second is convergence. Everybody's heard the word convergence, but how many people have heard the word convergence in the context of research? Okay, so if you invite me back, I'd be very happy to come next year. But
Okay.
I'm going to bet that everybody, 95% of the people here are going to hear it next year. So convergence it's sort of a newer kind of word for really deep interdisciplinary collaboration where you really understand where multiple disciplines are coming together and people coming from both sides understand the models, the methodologies of the different disciplines. I use bioinformatics as a great example of that. I mean, in that I think it's a case where computer scientists and biologists sort of came together, created a new discipline, and really took time to understand each other's disciplines and to define new challenges, right? So, you know, in the past, NSF has done interdisciplinary things where we say, well, you have to have at least one from column A and one from column B, and by definition, that's interdisciplinary, right? That's not what convergence is about. It's really about these deep partnerships and these deep understandings. And so given how many people hadn't heard about convergence, I'm a little worried if I ask how many people have heard about NSF's big ideas. Oh, well, I was actually visiting, I won't name the university, yesterday, and I asked that, and there was only one person, which was the department chair, so this is way better. But if you look at the big ideas, these are areas where the director of the National Science Foundation, the assistant directors have all gotten together and say, look, here are areas where we think that increased investments really pay huge marginal returns. So areas that are really just ripe for investment. I'm going to tell you what they are, but the punchline is that all of these are about convergence. So the research ones are harnessing the data revolution, so absolutely everything that Patti just said about the importance of data. And if you look at some of our programmatics in SCIES, like tripods, transdisciplinary research and principles of data science, right? That's about bringing statisticians, mathematicians, computer scientists, and computational scientists together. And there's sort of the application of data science in all these different domains. Sometimes we call it tripods plus X, and anyway, the names don't matter, but the notion that convergence and bringing disciplines together is so important for pushing forward research is a central theme of harnessing the data revolution. A second big idea is the future of work at the human technology frontier, right? Now, if you haven't thought yet about what your jobs and your kids' jobs and your grandkids' jobs are going to be like in 2030 and 2040, that's, it's a real challenging question. One of the, matter of fact, the NSF NSF supported a National Academy of Study called Information Technology and the Future of Work. It was, the group was co-chaired by Tom Mitchell, who leads the machine learning department at Carnegie Mellon University, and Erik Brynjolfsson, who's an economist at MIT and wrote the book, The Second Machine Age. Anybody read that? That's like a must-read over Christmas vacation if you haven't read it yet. And what they talked about there is this notion, so it's about humans and technology and what work is going to look like in 2030, and it went beyond this notion that robots are taking our jobs away, right? And what they really talked about are some of the really highly cognitive skilled tasks. Think about medicine. Think about law. What are those jobs going to be? You probably all know IBM's plans with taking Watson technology and applying it in medicine, for example. So the real gem they had in that report was thinking about work as a series of tasks. And some of those tasks, the kinds of technologies that we're working on here in the computer science community, will change how those tasks are done. Some of them might be automated, but the work will still involve humans. And so the central thesis of work at the human technology frontier is how to create workplaces and what work will look like when humans and technology have to interact. And that is all about bringing disciplines like computer science, the social, behavioral, and economic sciences together with engineering for engineered systems there. I'll just tell you the other four, I won't go into details, are navigating the new Arctic. It's about sensing and actually communities in the Arctic, the quantum leap, I mentioned navigating the new Arctic, and rules of life. And I will tell you that size is, forgive me for thinking that computer science is at the center of the universe, but we're involved in all of those things. And really, again, in all of those, convergence and bringing multiple disciplines together is absolutely central. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is something that Will mentioned, and that's partnerships. And so that you folks probably know that, some of you anyway, that within SISE, we've made a real concerted effort over the last couple of years to form partnerships with industry in particular. Those partnerships take a couple of different forms. We partner on infrastructure. So if you're in the big data program, Amazon Web Services, Google, and Microsoft have each contributed up to $3 million in cloud credits for big data funded PIs. Microsoft's also contributed to the big data hubs and spokes program. We have in wireless, which was mentioned a couple of times, there's the Power Platforms for Advanced Wireless Research to take research in wireless and also the socio-technical computer-human systems that are built on top of that for smart and connected communities, taking them out of the lab and trying those out in the wild. So NSF has invested, or will invest, $50 million over 7 years. A partnership of 31 companies and organizations was formed, and also formed to bring together $50 million in funding to match what NSF is doing there. So I think that's a great example. Another example in the way in which we partner with industry is on joint solicitations. So Intel and IBM, Intel and SISE have partnered on 5 different solicitations together in the last 3 years or so. We've also partnered with Semiconductor Research Corporation on 5, and with VMware on 1 on security within the cloud. And these kind of partnerships, I think, are exactly the kind of things that Will was talking about, where we can bring use-inspired challenges coming in from industry. We have technology transfer paths, but again, this is all fundamental, pre-competitive, basic research that we're talking about. So, you should always summarize when you're done, so I'm done. Just 3 things. If I run into any of you, and I recognize a lot of faces, I'm going to ask you 2 months from now, what were those 3 things that I mentioned? Socio-technical and computer-human systems, convergence, and partnerships. And so thank you again to CCC for everything, and thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, Jim. So our final panelist is Bill Regli, who's at DARPA. Prior to that, he was at Drexel University, and he's, I guess, going to Maryland next. So DARPA is, as you know, a mission agency, so they put money in things that can crystallize into new results in the relatively near future, while at the same time doing fundamental work. So it's an incredible balance. Bill is in the Defense Sciences Office, which is self-proclaimed DARPA's DARPA. And he's also an expert on Prague, some of which involves beer. I can tell you offline about that, so Bill.
Very good. Yeah, it's been my privilege to work at DARPA since 2014. Actually, excuse me, I started talking to DARPA in 2013. I started in 2014. I've been there just over 3 years. I wanted to start off my remarks by actually echoing something Dan Wallach said, which was if any of you feel moved to federal service, whether it's in the Air Force Scientific Advisory Board or a tour at DARPA, one way to bring your ideas to the federal government is to come and do your time. And I mean that in a positive way. I can't say that it has been easy. It's been exhausting. I mean, I was on the leadership team for 3 years at the agency. In the last several months, I actually am no longer the DSO office director. I've moved up to the 13th floor. I'm an advisor to the director for the next couple months. But it's been extraordinarily rewarding because I get to see science and engineering done at a national scale. I get to see what I like to think of as the problems that matter and keep us up at night. And then you start to think about how your discipline can arrange itself in response to these challenges, and the practicality of actually designing at DARPA a program where in 3 to 5 years you can actually make a dent. So that call to service is something I hope computer scientists see. And at DARPA, typically you look at the org chart and you might think that computing is only in the Information Innovation Office, and I'm actually here to tell you it's actually everywhere. I mean, almost every office has foundational work going on involving computing, algorithms, data. Computing is centralized in I2O because that's really a software systems office. It does a lot of basic computer science as well as software systems. But in my office, DSO, one of the things we realized at the time I arrived was that almost every single program manager was using data and computation as the Archimedes lever with which they were lifting the world and changing the problems they were solving. And I'd like to talk about a couple things here and leave you with, I hope, maybe a perspective that I've gathered at DARPA, and I appreciate the CRA printing out these two documents. So the first thing I want to make sure everybody understands is there's this Heilmeyer Catechism, which is the way DARPA thinks, and this is a very valuable thing to internalize. I felt it in my heart before I got to DARPA, and now that I've been there for 3 years, I cannot think any other way. So when we talk about these societal challenges, these grand challenges, some of which we heard from the other speakers, this is kind of the DARPA recipe book for how we build programs where within 3 to 5 years, we'll produce an output. So one of the things I tried to do is summarize some of my observations about where academics or where scientific communities may fall down. I mean, the Heilmeyer questions are deceptively simple, and when I say we live and breathe these, I mean, they are literally on the back of my ID card. So we take anything to Tech Council goes through this process. And what happens is communities tend to conflate the first and the third question, right? Where the what are you trying to do tends to be what your scientific milieu is, right? So I can't tell you how many people came to us in, say, the summer of 2015 saying, oh, DARPA, you're doing all this great work in robotics. I want to do robotics. And then you ask the question, well, what are you trying to do? And they say robotics. And you're like, well, what's the question? And robotics is the answer, and they've already decided that that's the thing that's going to be done. So the challenge that the community has, especially computer science, is almost every academic community, but computer science, I think, speaking is one. You know, we live in this world of techniques, and to map your technique to the question at hand and really be dispassionate in how you frame the problem, and then look at it as, okay, if I state the problem, what's the hypothesis I'm going to test? And maybe the technique that I'm good at happens to be the insight that I'm going to use to test that question or hypothesis. So understand that DARPA doesn't have fixed programs in topic A, B, C. We have 100 program managers who are living these questions every day. And they're trying to develop programs that follow these questions in order to create some kind of disruption or insight that leads to new capability for national security. And national security is very broad. It can be using data for military applications. It could be helping out with the Ebola crisis, which we did as well, because we're one of the few agencies that can mobilize that quickly to do things. So don't think that DARPA, the D in DARPA does mean defense, but the mission of the Defense Department is extraordinarily broad. And it doesn't mean that when you come to DARPA, you've got to have a military application as to what you're trying to do. If you look at the programs that the Defense Science Office has done under my tenure, you'll see things in photonics, you'll see things in radio communication among cells and biological entities. These are foundational scientific questions that to answer the question actually requires novel algorithms, signal processing, and sometimes computer science. So the second thing I want to point out then is that as we use this recipe book to develop programs across the whole agency, computer science is everywhere, and it's in the obvious places and some non-obvious places. So if you look across the portfolio, you'll see programs in assured autonomy, where we're trying to figure out how to make systems that use machine learning reliable in a software deployed environment, much like what's going on with autonomous vehicles. If we're going to use them, we have to make sure they work. We have programs that look at the mathematical limits of computation in machine learning, which is a really foundational theoretical computer science problem that we did a project in DSO about. We're also looking at issues of computing substrates. There's been a lot of work in quantum over the last decade or more, but we're looking at things like skyrmions, using chemicals to compute. We've had programs in neuromorphic computing. We've had programs in right now on graphical processing, essentially graph processing chips. So literally trying to change the underlying physics of computation. And that's not just chemists. It's computer scientists and mathematicians working together. So when we do this convergence thing at DARPA, the way we do it is we build a program, we put out a solicitation, but the call to arms to the community is that the computer science community has to see the computing problem in these problems. So we've had programs that look like they're for chemists, but in reality there's a huge computer science problem in the middle. So I'll point out the Make It program was one that myself and Tyler McQuaid, he was the program manager, but he and I went back and forth as he had this passion that we could take synthetic chemistry and change the problem into a computational one. And originally he said machine learning. I go, I don't think it's machine learning. It's really planning. It's what the chemist does at the bench is they plan how to go from raw materials to essentially some useful product at the end. So we developed this program. There's a big computing part in the middle, and I just would point out that one of the MacArthur Fellows this year is a woman, Regina Barzilay, at MIT, and she's a machine learning AI person. She's actually one of the performers on Make It, right? Reimagining chemistry, but there's more room for people in computer science if you're willing to kind of cross over the activation threshold, get involved with the chemist, get involved with the physicist. There's good computing to be done, but I believe the burden is actually on our community to take the first step, because most of the domain scientists don't know what they're missing. So that's the obvious places. Then there's non-obvious places. We have programs in material science and in engineering design and manufacturing, which have large computer science pieces. We have work in scientific discovery and social science, where cyber infrastructure is essentially reimagining how we can do reproducible social science and do experiments about social science techniques in simulation. And we have work on platforms. If you look at the major systems offices, we're building autonomous ships, we're building swarms, we're building novel military systems, all of which have some kind of computing, human-computer system. So the theme that NSF has about this socio-technical human-centered systems, one of the themes that cuts across all of DARPA is going back to the origins of human-machine symbiosis. If we look at the role of autonomy in AI, it's not to replace humans, it's essentially to put them together in different ways. And as I said yesterday to some of you who might have heard my question yesterday, one of the big challenges is how you reframe the equation, not just for the machine, but for the human. Because if the machine's doing all this amazing work, suddenly the human part changes. So that's what happened in the chemistry program, Make It, is that we have now undergraduate chemists doing as well as postdocs for chemical reaction sequence planning. So what's that mean for chemists? Their job hasn't gone away, but suddenly they've been elevated in some way. So we see this pattern over and over again. But I'd like to conclude with a reflection. So I wrote this piece that appeared in Communications ACM. Thank you, CRA, for printing it out. This is a personal reflection. It's not meant to represent the opinions of my agency. You'll see that's the tone I've written in it is really a personal reflection. I basically wrote this piece because I'm walking around the Defense Science Office and I'm like, wow, I'm the only computer scientist. Why am I so lonely? There's all these great problems, and how is it that we're not seeing it? And I think there's a maturity or an evolution that computing as a community needs to go through to realize that there are fundamental computer science problems to be found in material science, in certain physics problems, and the activation threshold we have to cross is that the domain scientists themselves don't know what they're missing. They're not going to have the most advanced computing techniques. We're going to have to meet them more than halfway to reimagine each and every domain jointly with these domain scientists. So my view of computing is that it's a lot like, if you think of the last 400 years, many have said the last 400 years is based on calculus and physics. Our world of science and engineering draws its origins to Newton, right? And if you look at the last 400 years, engineering is essentially applied physics of some sort. I personally believe that computation, algorithm data, represents a different form of scientific discourse. It doesn't replace physics, it's different. But that means that suddenly problems that have been pursued in one manner due to the mathematical techniques of education can now be looked at other ways. So whose responsibility is it to do that? So as a computer scientist, and I know a lot of physicists in my job, they don't sit there and go, well, that's not a physics problem. Every problem's a physics problem. Everything is fair game to a physicist.
And they can solve it.
And then they can solve it, right? So like social science, let me tell you, we have social science programs, and there's physicists on the social science programs. And I really wish computer scientists acted more like physicists instead of having physics envy. Just view computing everywhere, right? And you start to look at problems and you find that there's an algorithm to be had, but you might need to learn enough material science to find what the representation problem might be. So this was my reflection on these experiences at DARPA. I had a little recipe of what I think is the, how I find problems in different domains. But computer science can embrace this very large umbrella and transform many, many different problems. So from the standpoint of DARPA, we really hope that computer scientists look at the agency as a whole, see where they can contribute, write better proposals. I'm happy to provide my DARPA 101 slides to anybody. I've visited over 30 universities in the last 3 years. But I can't tell you what proposals to write. We need to basically have you all more aware about what the national security challenges are, and then have you break them down, and then show us where computing can be the lever with which we lift the world. So my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so now it's our chance to ask questions, and we don't have a podium mic, so I will volunteer my mic. Who wants to be first? Okay, Mark Hill, University of Wisconsin. So Jim, you articulated one way that the National Science Foundation is involving industry. I guess I have a question, and do you guys have other ideas, particularly Will, in industry for getting industry involved, like when it's totally pre-competitive? And I think even the harder question is what happens when you want to get industry involved for where there isn't really an industry quite there yet, right? You couldn't like invoke the search industry in order to do the pre-competitive work to develop Google.
Well, actually, the issue of what happens when there's not an industry there, I would say as a community, we are supplying the workforce that builds that community. I don't know what that means for companies that haven't yet been formed in areas that don't yet exist, but I think that we as a research and an education community in computer science, one of the really important things we do is we are training the scientists who are going to do those new things. And I'll take quantum as an example, right, where I think we're just now starting to see with Google and Microsoft and IBM and Intel that we're seeing a presence of quantum in industry, and a lot of the people who started those labs at those companies actually came from academia first. So in many ways, we're sort of the wellspring of those ideas that sort of then take hold in industry before they actually happen.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, I guess building things that are useful is really difficult, right? And I think one way that we humans do that is you bring the user as close to the developer as possible, right? And I think one thing that industry kind of can bring to these challenges is like we actually have a better sense of just what, like, can you make money doing this? Is there a business model to support this? Is this sustainable? Is this realistic? Are people actually going to pay for this? How do industry can kind of represent the user in a sense when you're developing new things, because we have to turn around and figure out how to sell something to somebody. So I think that closing the loop there is important. I don't know how you do it exactly. It has to be the right level of research, I think, to some extent. Like really, really basic stuff, it doesn't really it's hard to see how you're going to turn around and sell it. But I don't know. But if it's too far towards figuring out what you're going to sell, I think then you're not asking fundamental questions. So I'm not really sure is the short answer.
Okay, other comments?
NIH has a mechanism called CRADA that some of you may be familiar with, the Cooperative Research and Development Agreements, which are NIH industry or NIH industry and university partnerships. And they're really designed to accelerate tech transfer and national competitiveness. They can be at a pre-competitive level, or they can be at a almost to market level.
Thanks for your comments. My name is Francisco Muñoz Arriola from the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. The question I have is regarding something that you all mentioned, and is the interdisciplinary part. So for junior faculty or for the rest of the audience, we are developing groups or we are involved in different groups. How are we evaluated when we submit a proposal? What would be the message that you would like to give us in order to develop a strong proposal or at least something that sounds good for a panel that is formed by multidisciplinary people, not necessarily interdisciplinary in essence? This is obviously because in the past we didn't have this strength in the interdisciplinary research.
Well, I guess I'll be happy to take a first crack at that. There's actually been one round of solicitations, a Convergence Dear Colleague letter, where I think that came out at the beginning of this year, and we've actually made funding and made awards in investments in a number of different areas. I think the key thing is to really demonstrate the convergence. And what I mean by that is somehow, if you bring together two teams and it looks like it's a divide by N because there are N interdisciplinary teams, that doesn't work. And it's hard to say, well, okay, well, what's the secret recipe for not having divide by N? But I will tell you, as someone who was a faculty member, we're on ERCs and STC visits where the teams are saying we are interdisciplinary, you can see it. And so I think the advice I would give people is make sure that you really are interdisciplinary. One way to think about that was pull somebody out. Is the whole thing not going to work? Well, everybody's got to be integral there. I will say on the agency side, and I won't speak for other agencies, but that it's still a hard challenge, and NSF is still working very hard to figure out how to now evaluate those, right? And so we want to bring in experts, not just the disciplinary experts who can say, oh yeah, I get that piece of mind of my particular area, but people who've also worked across multiple disciplines and done that kind of deep convergence work. And that's a challenge for the foundation.
So the NIH does support interdisciplinary work also, and there's the appetite right now is actually quite high for interactions with disciplines outside of the traditional health disciplines. The critical aspects in an NIH proposal are that the team should be formed with a mechanism to address the problem at hand. And so it can't be the divide by N, and it needs to be clear the different roles and interdependencies. For newly formed teams, it's critical to have an explanation of how the team is going to build, how decisions will be made, who's going to call questions when there's a problem in function. And the third part is that the recognition that NIH, unlike NSF, provides academic year support, so it's often looked on with longing. They hope that we can provide some faculty support or buyout time. And that does make sense, provided you have the right level of people involved. So too little, 5% of several senior investigators, it's very hard to believe that team's going to really function very well. And yet 40% of several senior investigators, it's not clear who's going to really get any of the work done. So it needs to be properly balanced with a credible plan for integration.
I should just add, DARPA works differently. We don't do peer review. We do a source selection. Scientific review board is formed, and the best way to stand out when you're writing your DARPA proposals is to essentially come with the best ideas. So we've done a number of experiments with the way we do reviews and submissions, and tried to place the emphasis on the idea generation, how far out can you think, asking people to think about the Heilmeier questions even when they write their white papers or abstracts. And then to the degree to which you need those people to deliver the novelty, then that's your team, right? So don't assemble the team and look for the problem. Find the problem you want to solve and then build the team, right? That's the DARPA way. So.
That's great, Bill, and it really goes hard to it. I'm Ben Schneiderman, University of Maryland. Thank you for these illuminating and energetic presentations, and the whole sessions here really give me hope for a positive outcome to move this way. But waving the high mark, how do we get there? So, there's a few parts to that. Getting there on the side of the agencies who fund it. Convergence and partnership are good labels, but then making it happen is a challenge. So I see some positive examples like AITF, Algorithms in the Field, which said we need a domain expert and a theory person working on a real problem. And I think generalizing that would happen. But I'm asking you, how do we get there on the side of the academic research culture? How do we change the culture so that tenure review and promotions respect, value, not just interdisciplinary, but high-impact problem solving that produces theory results and applications that are validated and move? You need to do both. Theory alone is not enough. It's dreaming. Basic research alone is far out and often wasted time. 70% of basic research papers have fewer than 9 citations. So we can't just support basic research. We need to get both, the basic and the applied at the same time. We want to do both. But how do we change the campus culture to make that acceptable?
All you.
Can I go first?
All you.
Yeah.
Thank you for asking that question, Ben, because actually Francisco asked a little bit of that question also, and I wanted to address it, but I was trying to think, well, how can I address the question that Francisco asked, but you just asked it, so now we can talk about this. I went to a very interesting conversation or meeting at IBM where we talked about interdisciplinary research, and it gets to the heart of the question that you asked on academic culture. And I will just tell you, I won't name any names, but there were a lot of senior people in the room, and all of them had done very interdisciplinary things. Every single one of them said, I did it after I was at a point in my career where I could just go and do it, and I didn't care what anybody said, and I didn't care about my evaluations, and et cetera, et cetera. I did it because it was intellectually exciting, and I wanted to do it. And there were also some graduate students and some junior faculty in the room who were sort of very taken aback by that. And I think it's a huge challenge for academia. Especially if you're coming in and into an interdisciplinary area, or you're a junior pre-tenure faculty member before tenure, and you want to do something interdisciplinary, there's always that worry that when you go out and talk to letter writers, that, well, this person will say, well, yeah, in my area I see that contribution, in my area I see this contribution, but in some ways the real contribution is bringing those together and creating something new, and that can be lost. So there is a CCC white paper that's now 10 years old, or a CRA white paper on best practices for tenure and maybe also promotion for interdisciplinary. And so everybody who, if you're in a leadership position in your department or your faculty member, you should just read that, right? I will tell you that, this is a really important problem for our field, and if you go around to any department and say this is a problem, everybody will say that's a really important problem. But of course, in my department, everything works great, right? So if you sample everybody individually, there's no problem, but everybody will agree there's a systemic problem, and it really is a challenge. It's a great question, Ben. I'm not sure what the answer is, right? But I do believe it's a challenge. I think it's primarily a challenge for junior faculty and for graduates.
I'd like to reflect on one thing that from the viewpoint of the science office at DARPA, it was a privilege because I got to see the machinery of science in the United States kind of do its thing for a few years. And if any of you have read Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, you can sort of watch the rhetoric of science play itself out when a community comes to you and says, oh, we just held a workshop and this is the problem DARPA should do. And you sort of go, well, if you know it, that means you're in the puzzle-solving mode of normal science. And if DARPA is supposed to do something really disruptive, we probably shouldn't do that, right? So the traditional reward systems enforce the puzzle-solving mode of normal science because that's where I'm going to get my next incremental paper. And if I want to move people towards the disruptions, we've had to work very hard to kind of create a safe space and emphasize. When I do these outreach, I always hit up the dean or the VPR. I say, if people want to work with DARPA, we're going to put them in places where they're uncomfortable. They're going to be working for us. They're not really doing their own thing. They're working on a program. So they need to be incentivized, rewards. I think somehow we have to just keep talking about it. It's a little bit like Penn and Teller. If you're doing magic and you're not aware that there's an illusion going on, I think that's the Kuhnian view. If you look at how we function as scientists, well, there's some machinery about how we reward ourselves, and we're just manipulating that, right? So let's at least be conscious that that's what's going on and driving everybody's egos. If we want to move people out of the boxes, we have to put the breadcrumbs in the right place and then create the safe space for people to do it.
So we're going to do 2 more questions.
Okay. Right here and right here. Hi, Jonathan Bisk of University of Washington. As one of the maybe really young people, I wanted to maybe shift some of the conversation to much earlier in the pipeline. So particularly NSF and NIH think about things like funding of curricula and stuff like this. And so particularly in the context of something like interdisciplinary research, like I have this one project with a biologist that has taken an incredibly long time, mostly because I don't understand any biology and she doesn't understand any of my neural nets. And so we're in this kind of weird thing where we slowly teach each other an entire curriculum basically to get to a paper. And so I love this idea that like, oh, everything is computer science and we should be like physicists who kind of think that way. But I sort of wonder if maybe it's more like there should be computational people in all of the fields. And that's like a different kind of model. And so I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on that future and what this should look like.
So part of the challenge is that computation has its own substantive area of investigation, and if we put computation everywhere, we run the risk of turning computation into a utility, right? So we need new investigation in the area. I do think that some of our training programs are starting to shift. I have to say Wisconsin, although we both have our bleeding red proud on here, is really one of the best examples of taking computational biology and computer science and making them talk to each other. And it's been 16 years to get that program to where it is right now, so it does take time. I think from an individual investigation team perspective, it does require a much more energy than it's expected, so it can't be a project-by-project basis. It really has to be thought of in the context of a program of research and a commitment, almost like a marriage. We're going to stick this through the bad days and good days till we get to a point where it runs smooth enough for the public to see.
So I'd just like to make a comment at the undergraduate level. There's a number of universities have talked about, in some cases have started programs called CS plus X, and informatics programs have done that, information schools have done that as well. And it's really trying to reach out to a different set of students that maybe come through our standard CS1, CS2, discrete math, sort of up the traditional computer science curriculum. It's reaching out to students who are interested in the application of computing in other disciplines. So they're grounded in another discipline. They understand that if they take a computational view towards their discipline, it opens up new doors and new possibilities for them, either in terms of how they're applying it in a job or whatever, but they're grounded very deeply in another discipline and they know computer science well also. And so I'll give a shout out, since I don't see anybody here from Illinois, the University of Illinois CS plus X program I'm a huge fan of. You should look at what they've done there and some of the plus X's that they have there. At the National Science Foundation, we had CS plus X as part of the RED, Revolutionizing Engineering and Computer Science departments, and we're sort of discussing making that even more central to some of our undergraduate education activities. So it's a great question.
Last question.
I'm Keith Marzullo. I'm one of the older people in the room, so I can ask a question from that point of view. And actually, my question is more of a shout out. I want to thank NSF. They ran this incredibly great workshop. You know how they run these career workshops to help people write careers? They instead ran a workshop to help people write large proposals. That is, they pulled people together to say, how do we assemble the teams and how do we think about doing research that actually moves things forward, can bring together multidisciplinary teams and actually do something like that. There's a kind of lack of patterning, I think, in academics about how to do this kind of research. We're all focused on tenure and such. So I just want to have that shout out and then turn it to you folks and say, are there other kinds of activities you think that you could do to help change the way that researchers think about approaching projects? Of course, DARPA, you do this all the time, but is there some way to actually maybe put a little bit of nudging money to get people in that direction?
Well, we do it at DARPA, like we do an annual Proposers Day or workshop, and one of the things that happened under my stewardship in DSO was we realized that the role the Defense Science Office plays was different than, say, the Systems and Platform Offices, because we were what I like to call the gateway drug to DARPA for most universities. There's something for everybody, and we're the most accessible. So we went from being a traditional Proposers Day where it's meet the PMs and hear what they want to do, to one where we spent actually preparatory time coaching potential performers on how to think so that they could come and have a productive conversation with the program managers, which then could lead to either a project with the program managers or maybe a seedling, or at least they would have felt there was some value to the thought process. And we funded out of the Proposers Days projects each of the last 2 years. which was somebody came with a crazy idea, and we're like, we want that one. So yeah, it's not a lot. I mean, we're talking, on order of, you can count on two hands maybe the number of projects like that. But I think it's more valuable for us to get people thinking differently. And if we get you thinking differently, good stuff's going to happen whether or not we fund it. I mean, NSF might fund it. It just depends on who has the home for the question, right? And whether there's a program manager who's passionate about the problem.
So,
Okay, very good. So, you want to say something?
well, I really like the idea of nudging funding, and maybe they're a little bit like DARPA seedlings, but NSF is certainly, one place where that might be funded. I'd actually turn it back on the universities, and in particular deans, for example. So my experience at the University of Massachusetts is when we started a really big program. Keith is a dean, so that's why I was smiling at him. The dean of engineering there wanted to do, said, we've got tremendous strengths there in radar systems and microwave remote sensing and in computing, and so, here's some nudging money to work together, and that's what happens in institutes. You see lots of universities setting up institutes to enable this kind of collaboration. I don't know, how often nudging money comes along to actually fund students, because nothing happens unless students are involved, but maybe that's part of the secret recipe on campuses.
Okay, so we'll let everybody in the same order make a brief statement if you have one, and then I'll make a brief closing, unless you want to do so. You go to you? Okay.
Sure. I'll just reiterate my 3 points. I mean, I think we need more investment, money and resources, more collaboration. So the kind of thing you're talking about, I think we don't often fund the social infrastructure building stuff sufficiently, right? It's easy to fund a program or research, but you never want to fund the stuff to get people in the room together, right? So more collaboration, and we don't always know, I guess innovation is not always predictable, and therefore impact is not always predictable.
And I want to remind you that there are interesting and important problems in healthcare that a computational lens might bring an opening to a whole new way of thinking about the problem and solving it.
Socio-technical convergence partnerships.
Wow, what do I say after all that?
Heilmeyer.
Really, that's it. This is the Heilmeyer, that's it. Computer scientists, apply this to your favorite global grand challenge and see what you come up with. And that can be, at the end of the day, I only write proposals if I know I can win or if I'm going to learn something. So try and focus yourself on stuff that you find of value, and use a framework like this to focus your efforts. So.
Okay, so let's thank all the panelists, and I guess